A lie told once can be forgiven as panic. A lie told twice starts to become a decision. But a lie told every day, for 40 years, at breakfast tables, birthday parties, graduations, church dinners, family photos, Christmas mornings, hospital visits, weddings, funerals, that is not just a lie anymore. That is a manufactured life. A life built carefully, brick by brick, on silence. A life where everyone learns what not to ask. A life where one child grows up feeling different, but is handed an explanation every single time she gets too close to the truth. A life where the family photo looks perfect from the outside, as long as nobody notices who's always standing at the edge of the frame. My name is Faith Delaney. I'm 41 years old, and last summer, in front of 150 members of my extended family, one envelope destroyed the life my parents had spent 4 decades protecting. Not because the truth was new, not because my parents had just found out, but because they had known all along. I was not my father's daughter. My brother was only my half-brother. My sister was only my half-sister. And the man whose name I had carried my entire life had spent 40 years trying to love me and failing. The worst part? The man who was actually my biological father had no idea I existed. All it took was one family reunion and one woman who thought DNA kits would be a fun surprise. So before I take you back to that Saturday afternoon in Ohio, the afternoon my counterfeit life finally expired, subscribe, like the video, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Because what happened that day didn't just expose a secret. It exposed the architecture of my entire childhood. And once you see the pattern, you can never unsee it. Every June since 1982, the Delaney family reunion had taken over my grandparents' farmstead outside Columbus, Ohio. If you drove past it on reunion day, you'd see white tents rising out of the grass, folding tables lined end to end, coolers full of soda, kids running behind the barn, and old men arguing about weather and baseball in lawn chairs they brought from home. It looked wholesome, stable, American in the most familiar way possible, the kind of family gathering people romanticize. The Delaneys were that kind of family. My father, Gerald Delaney, owned the oldest hardware store in the county. My mother, Linda Delaney, chaired the women's ministry at Grace Lutheran. They were known, respected, trusted, the kind of couple people described as solid. That word followed them everywhere. Solid marriage, solid values, solid family. And if you asked anyone in town what kind of woman Linda Delaney was, they'd say organized, devoted, generous, strong in faith, always dependable. They would not say manipulative. They would not say strategic. They would not say capable of living inside a lie so completely that even her own daughter would spend 40 years doubting herself before doubting her mother. I arrived at the farm at 7 that morning, 2 hours before the rest of the family, not because I wanted to, because my mother had called me at 6:15 and said, "Bring the potato salad, honey, and get there early. I've already assigned everything." That was my mother's style. She never asked what you wanted. She assigned tasks, roles, emotions, narratives. Everything had a place, and she liked being the one who decided what that place was. So I came early. I carried trays. I unfolded tablecloths. I arranged condiments. I set out cups. I made sure the drink station looked right. I placed folding chairs in neat rows. I tied balloons to the post near the barn. I moved like I always moved in my family. Useful, available, quiet. When my brother Ryan arrived at 9, he walked straight to the grill where my father was standing. Gerald handed him a beer before he'd even taken off his sunglasses. When my sister Megan arrived at 9:30 with a store-bought pie and a story about traffic, everyone laughed and waved her in. Nobody mentioned that I'd already been there for 2.5 hours. Nobody thanked me. That used to hurt me. Then eventually it became normal. And that's the dangerous thing about emotional neglect. If it happens slowly enough, you stop calling it neglect. You start calling it personality, tradition, family dynamics. No big deal. There's a framed family portrait in my mother's living room. It was taken about 8 years ago. My father in the middle, my mother at his side, Ryan and Megan close in, all of them blonde, all of them easy in the frame, and me on the far right, just slightly off-center, slightly outside the balance of the picture. The first time I noticed it, I joked about it. I asked my mother why I always seemed to end up at the edge of family photos. She smiled immediately and said, "That's where the photographer told you to stand." My mother always had an answer. What I didn't know was that explanations were her most polished survival skill. Now here's what you need to understand about me before the reunion changed everything. I have dark hair, not brown like chestnut or warm auburn. Dark, almost black. My eyes are green, deep green, the kind strangers comment on. Nobody in the Delaney family has green eyes. My father's eyes were blue. My mother's were gray. Ryan's were blue. Megan's were blue. Mine were green. When I was 12, I finally asked my mother why I didn't look like anyone else in the family. She didn't hesitate for even a second. "You take after my side," she said. Great Aunt Dorothy had dark hair, and because I was 12, I believed her. Because children are built to believe the people they depend on. Doubt takes energy. Trust is automatic. Ryan got my father's note nose. Megan got my mother's smile. And I got explanations. I became an emergency room nurse. I've worked at Mercy General for 16 years. Mostly nights, mostly chaos. And I'm good at it. I'm good at staying steady while everyone else is panicking. I'm good at reading body language before words catch up. I'm good at hearing what isn't being said. It took me 40 years to realize I probably got good at all of that because I was raised in a house where the emotional temperature was always shifting, but no one was allowed to name the weather. If you want to understand which child in a family knows the truth first, watch the one who learns to read tension instead of language. Watch the one who notices who gets overlooked. Watch the one who doesn't belong in the face of the family, but belongs in the work of it. That was me. I didn't know it yet on that June morning, but by the end of the day, every strange feeling I'd had since childhood would finally have a name, and the person who brought that name into the open was my Aunt Patty. Patricia, technically. Patty to everyone. She was my mother's younger sister, a retired history teacher with a love for order, accuracy, and family lineage. She alphabetized her spice rack. She color-coded old photographs. She could tell you which relative entered through Ellis Island and what ship they arrived on. Genealogy wasn't just a hobby for Patty. It was a mission. 6 months before the reunion, she had mailed DNA kits to 23 members of the family, one person from each major branch. She'd called it a reunion surprise, a celebration of roots, a fun activity. Spit in the tube and mail it back, she said. We'll all see where we come from. Everyone agreed. Why wouldn't they? Nobody thought ancestry would turn into evidence. Around 11:30 that morning, when most of the family had arrived and the food tables were finally full, Aunt Patty stepped up to the microphone Uncle Dave usually used for the blessing. She tapped it twice and smiled. I have a surprise for everyone. She held up a cardboard box. Inside were 23 sealed envelopes. People laughed immediately. Cousins started teasing each other. Someone shouted they were probably part royal. One of the teenagers claimed he was definitely Scandinavian because he liked winter. It was light, easy, safe. That's the thing about disasters. Right before they happen, everything still looks normal. I took my envelope and sat down, and for the first time in my life, I felt something close to relief. Because finally, I thought, finally, I'll know. Not the big truth. I wasn't even close to imagining that, but I thought maybe I'd find some distant Mediterranean branch on my mother's side, some explanation for the hair, the eyes, the way I never quite matched the family around me. I thought I was about to solve a mystery. I had no idea I was about to detonate a bomb. I looked up before opening my envelope. My mother wasn't smiling. Her hand was wrapped so tightly around her glass of iced tea that her knuckles had gone white. She wasn't laughing with the others. She wasn't even pretending well. Her face had gone pale in a way I had never seen before. Then I looked at my father. Gerald wasn't confused. He wasn't amused. He wasn't curious. He looked afraid. Aunt Patty started the countdown. 3, 2, 1. Envelopes opened all across the yard. At first there was laughter. Uncle Dave announcing his English ancestry like he'd won a prize. A cousin yelling that she was 3% Scandinavian after all. A teenage nephew thrilled to discover some ancestry he'd never expected. Then slowly, subtly, the sound began to collapse. Not everywhere at once. At our table first. That's one thing working in an ER teaches you. You know the moment a room changes. Before anyone says it, before alarms go off, before the full emergency becomes visible, you feel the shift. That's what happened at our table. I unfolded my paper. The ethnicity estimate was strange right away. Heavy Southern European, Italian, and Mediterranean markers that made no sense for the family story I'd been told. But I barely had time to process that because just below the ancestry breakdown was a section labeled DNA relatives. I saw my brother's name first. Ryan Delaney, predicted relationship, half-sibling. Then Megan Delaney, predicted relationship, half-sibling. My stomach dropped so fast it felt physical. Then I saw Gerald Delaney. No match, no match. I stared at those two words and felt the whole world pull sideways. Then I saw the last name, Thomas Calloway, predicted relationship, father. I had never heard that name in my life. I looked up. My mother was staring at me across the table, and for the first time in 40 years, I was not looking at my mother. I was looking at a woman who had been caught, not embarrassed, not confused, not blindsided. Caught. She stood so quickly her chair scraped backward through the grass. These things make mistakes all the time, she said, too brightly, too quickly. Patty, you know that, right? Labs get things wrong. Aunt Patty blinked at her. Linda, I used the same company for all 23 kits. Same batch. Well, clearly something happened. My father said nothing. Ryan looked from face to face, confused. Megan was still holding her paper, eyes darting over the lines, trying to catch up. Then Ryan asked the question no one else had dared. What's going on? And before my mother could answer, my father finally spoke. There's no mistake. His voice was flat, heavy, final, the kind of voice a man uses when he is too tired to keep holding a door shut. He still wasn't looking at my mother. He looked down at the table. Then finally, slowly, he raised his eyes and looked straight at me. I've known since before you were born. Everything inside me went cold. Around us, 150 family members were suddenly very quiet. No one coughed, no one moved, no one reached for food. The entire reunion seemed to freeze in place, like somebody had pressed pause on a life I no longer recognized. And in those few seconds, my brain did something extraordinary and cruel. It started pulling evidence. Career day. He went to Megan's class, not mine. Fishing trips. Room for Ryan, room for Megan, never room for me. My graduation. Signed check, empty seat. My wedding. He walked me down the aisle, then gave a toast so short it felt like obligation, not love. Every memory I had ever excused suddenly reorganized itself into a pattern. He hadn't been emotionally distant because he was quiet. He hadn't forgotten because he was busy. He hadn't missed moments because he was old-fashioned. He had known, and now I knew. I put the envelope down carefully on the table. I stood up. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. People think grief always looks dramatic. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it looks like a woman going completely still because every ounce of energy in her body is being used just to remain upright. I looked at my mother and said very calmly, "How long were you going to let me live inside your lie?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time in my life, Linda Delaney, the woman who always had a polished answer, a graceful redirect, a reason things weren't what they looked like, had nothing to say. What happened next looked like chaos if you were inside it, but from the outside it probably looked civilized. That's how families like mine fall apart, quietly, respectably, in full public view. My mother began to cry, pressing her hands to her chest as though she were the one under attack. Not the grief of someone who regrets harm, the panic of someone whose image has fractured. Ryan stood up so quickly his chair tipped, but he didn't turn toward our mother. He turned toward Aunt Patty. "Are you happy now?" he snapped. "Was this worth it, your little project?" Patty looked stunned. "Ryan, I had no idea." "That's the problem," he said. "You didn't think." There it was, deflection. A pattern so old in my family it practically had roots. My mother lied. My father kept the lie alive. But somehow the first person being blamed was the one who opened the envelope. Let me tell you something about families built on silence. When the truth comes out, people almost never attack the architect first. They attack the person who switched on the light. Because if the truth is the problem, then the liar can still be protected. I heard one of my older relatives whisper from the dessert table, "Poor Linda. Poor Linda, not poor Faith, not poor woman who just found out her entire identity had been managed for 40 years. Poor Linda." My father stood up and walked away without saying another word, straight toward the barn, like the only thing he knew how to trust was wood, tools, and walls. I followed my mother into the farmhouse kitchen. She always went to the kitchen when she needed control. That room belonged to her. The counters, the drawers, the order, the familiar objects. It was the place where she knew how to perform certainty. Two of my aunts hovered in the doorway behind her. Good, I thought. Let them hear this. I looked at her and said, "Explain it. All of it." She wiped her face with a paper towel, inhaled, and did what she had always done best. She told a story. "In 1985, your father was away for 3 months helping set up the second hardware store location," she said. "I was 23, alone all the time, no car half the week, no family nearby. Thomas Calloway was the carpenter hired to repair the farmhouse roof." She paused just long enough to shape herself into someone sympathetic. "It just happened." I said nothing. When I got pregnant, the timeline didn't work. I knew. I told Gerald when I was 7 months along. Another pause. He had 2 choices, leave or stay. She said it like this was a difficult love story, like the moral complexity of it somehow softened the damage. "If he left, I lost everything," she continued. "The house, the church, insurance, stability. You kids would have suffered." "No," I thought. "You suffered the consequences of your choices. Then you assigned those consequences to the rest of us and called it sacrifice." "So he stayed," she said, "and we agreed nobody would ever know." I stared at her. "Does Thomas Calloway know I exist?" She looked away. "No." That answer landed even harder than I expected, because it meant this wasn't just a lie about me, it was a theft. She hadn't only taken the truth from me, she had taken me from the man who was actually my father. 40 years. 40 years of birthdays, school photos, scraped knees, college applications, bad breakups, nursing school stress, wedding vows, divorce papers, night shifts, every version of me that ever existed, and he knew nothing. "You didn't preserve a family," I said quietly. "You preserved a secret." She started crying harder. "Everything I did for you kids." That sentence had been her signature my entire life. Everything I did for you. Every control tactic wrapped in sacrifice. Every manipulation dressed up as motherhood. No, I said. Everything you did for yourself. Then I went looking for Gerald. I found him in the barn sitting on a wooden chair near the tool bench, holding an unopened can of beer. Dust floated in the light coming through the cracks in the wood. A horsefly hit the window once, then again. He looked smaller in that barn than I had ever seen him. Not fragile, just tired. Why did you stay? I asked. He turned the can in his hands without opening it. Because this is my family's farm, he said finally. Because my mother was alive. Because of the store. Because of the church. Because of everything I'd built here. He took a breath. And because I thought I could love you like my own. I waited. Then he said the words that split me open deeper than the DNA results had. I couldn't. There are truths that wound because they're cruel. And then there are truths that wound because they explain everything. That was one of those truths. I suddenly understood every empty seat, every forgotten birthday, every flat smile, every emotional absence I had spent a lifetime trying to reinterpret. He had tried, and failed. You knew every day, I said. Every single day, you knew why. He finally looked at me. Telling you wouldn't have helped. It would have helped me understand. He had no answer for that. I didn't hate him in that moment. And somehow that made it worse. Hatred would have been cleaner, easier, but what I felt was something more complicated. Recognition. I finally understood the design of my childhood. Every room I wasn't invited into. Every door that stayed emotionally closed. Every moment where Ryan and Megan were children and I was responsibility. I walked out of the barn and toward my car. Ryan caught up with me in the driveway before I got there. His face was flushed. He'd clearly been arguing with someone, probably Patty, probably anyone available. You need to stop, he said. You're making everything worse. Worse for who? For all of us. There it was again. Family systems protect themselves before they protect the injured person. He stepped closer, lowered his voice, tried to sound reasonable. They raised you. They fed you. They paid for nursing school. What more do you want? The truth. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. The truth is Dad stayed. He didn't have to. He stayed. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time I saw what was under his anger. Fear. Because if our father had lived with this secret for 40 years, then Ryan's own understanding of our family was collapsing too. His place wasn't as threatened as mine, but his certainty was dying right in front of him, and certainty makes people cruel when it starts slipping. An older cousin passed behind us on the way to her car and touched Ryan's arm. Your poor mother, she murmured. Not one person touched mine. He looked back at me and said, softer this time, You're still my sister. And for the first time in my life, I didn't know how to answer that. I got in my car and drove to the end of the gravel road. Then I stopped. I couldn't go home yet. My hands were locked around the steering wheel. The engine was still running. Dust from the driveway floated through the air behind me and settled over everything I had just learned. My phone buzzed. It was Megan. I'm on the back porch. Come sit with me. So I turned around. She was sitting on the porch swing with her knees pulled up, her DNA results folded in half beside her. When I sat down, she didn't start with questions. She didn't defend anyone. She just sat there beside me while the swing creaked back and forth. After a minute, she said quietly, Do you remember when you used to joke that you'd been delivered to the wrong family? I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Yeah, I thought you were kidding. I wasn't. She wiped at her face. I noticed things too. I looked at her. The way Dad always took pictures with me and Ryan and somehow forgot to call you over. The way Mom talked about us. Ryan got a story, I got a story. And for you it was always, Faith is fine, she's busy. I didn't tell her it was okay, because it wasn't, but I put my hand over hers. Then she told me something that shifted everything again. Mom called me 3 times the week before the reunion, she said. She kept asking if Patty had said anything about the DNA results. I turned to her slowly. She already knew, Megan said. She was scared. That meant my mother had warning. She had time. She could have called Patty and stopped the envelopes. She could have told me privately. She could have chosen truth before public exposure forced it out of her. But she didn't. She gambled on silence one more time, and lost. That night, back in my apartment, I typed a name into a search bar. Thomas Calloway. It took less than 30 seconds. Calloway Custom Woodwork, Granville, Ohio, a business page, a Facebook profile, A profile photo of a man in his 60s standing beside a finished dining table. Silver hair, weathered hands, green eyes, my eyes. I stared at that picture so long the screen dimmed. All those years of wondering why I didn't look like anyone in my family. And there he was, 3 inches tall on a phone screen, a stranger with my face hidden in his. My hands started shaking. That almost never happens to me. I've held pressure on open wounds. I've watched monitors flatline. I've kept my voice steady while families collapsed in waiting rooms. But a picture of a man with my eyes made my hands shake. I wanted to call him right then. I wanted to hear his voice. I wanted to ask if he knew how many things had just rearranged themselves inside me. But I didn't. Because Thomas Calloway had a life. Maybe children, maybe grandchildren, maybe a whole world that had never imagined me. And I had something else to think about too. I was 6 weeks into the adoption process for a little girl named Lily. She was 6 years old, with brown hair and serious eyes, and she had already been moved through foster care more times than any child should be. Her file was on my kitchen table. Her future was depending, in part, on the medical history I had submitted. And suddenly I realized that history might be wrong. My phone lit up all evening. My mother first. We need to talk in person. Come home. We'll sort this out as a family. Then another. This is Patty's fault. She had no right to do this that way. Then another. Don't make this bigger than it is. That one almost made me laugh, because people only say don't make it bigger when they know it already is. Ryan texted too. Mom's been crying all night. Are you satisfied? Satisfied. As if the exposure of a 40-year deception was some petty argument I had started because I was in a bad mood. I didn't answer any of them. At nearly midnight, my mother sent one last message. Everything I did for you. There it was again. The script. Her oldest line. The polished one. The one that converted control into care and silence into sacrifice. I put my phone face down and stared at the ceiling. The next morning, reality hit harder than emotion. I sat at my kitchen table with Lily's adoption file open in front of me. Page 7. Family medical history. I had filled it in 2 months earlier based on everything I thought I knew about the Delaney side. Heart disease, arthritis, diabetes, conditions that, as it turned out, might not belong to me at all. I called Lily's caseworker and explained as calmly as I could that there had been a major change in my biological family information and the medical history I had submitted needed to be corrected. There was a pause on the line. Then she said, "We'll need updated information before we can move forward. If you can't provide accurate family medical history, it could delay the process." Delay. That word hit me harder than any text my mother had sent, because somewhere across town, a child who had already waited too long was still waiting. Lily had been failed by enough adults. I was not going to be one more, which meant I needed the truth. Not for closure, not for healing, not even for justice. For paperwork, for her. I called Aunt Patty. She answered on the first ring. "Faith, I need your help." She didn't ask why. She didn't defend herself. She didn't cry. She just said, "Tell me what you need. Can you get me Thomas Calloway's contact information from the Ancestry match?" Of course. She called back 15 minutes later with a mailing address, the Ancestry message portal, and more guilt in her voice than she deserved to carry. The next day, we met at a coffee shop. Patty brought her laptop and walked me through the DNA dashboard again. Thomas Calloway, parent match. Then, halfway through, she hesitated. "There's something I need to tell you." My stomach tightened. When the results came back 3 weeks before the reunion, I reviewed them before printing. I saw that Gerald wasn't a match, and I thought maybe it was a processing issue. So I called your mother and asked if there was anything I should know before I printed the packets. I went still. "You called Mom?" Patty nodded. "She told me to print everything." That meant my mother hadn't just been warned. She had been given a private exit, an off-ramp, a chance to tell me herself. And she chose not to, because pulling my results would have raised questions. Because telling the truth required surrendering control. Because silence was still, in her mind, the safest option. I went home that night and called the one person I knew would listen without trying to manage me. June Porter, my best friend since college, a social worker, mother of 2, the kind of woman who could hold pain without rushing to close it. She answered on the second ring. I said, "I finally know why I never felt like I belonged." She didn't say, "Are you okay?" She didn't say, "Calm down." She didn't say, "Maybe there's more to the story." She said, "Tell me all of it." So I did. The reunion, the envelopes, my mother's face, Gerald's confession, Ryan's anger, Megan on the porch, Thomas's green eyes in a Facebook photo, Lily's paperwork, all of it. When I finished, June said, "You get to decide what happens next." I was quiet. "I want to contact him," I said, "but I'm scared." "Of what?" "That he won't want me either." Her voice softened. "Then you'll know. And knowing is always better than wondering." The next evening, I opened the Ancestry portal and started typing. I rewrote the message 6 times. Too formal, too emotional, too cold, too desperate. Finally, I wrote, "Mr. Calloway, my name is Faith Delaney. A recent DNA test suggests you may be my biological father. I was born in March 1986. I don't want to disrupt your life, but if you're open to it, I would like to speak with you." I hit send. Then I went to work. 12 hours later, after 1 fracture, 3 admissions, and more coffee than anyone should drink, I came home, showered, and opened the app. There was one new message. "Faith, I have been staring at your message for 6 hours. I didn't know. I am so sorry. I didn't know. Yes, please call me." I read it 5 times. The words that stayed with me were not "yes, please call me." They were, "I didn't know." Because in my family, everyone who had this secret had known. My mother knew. Gerald knew. My aunts and maybe others probably suspected enough to stay quiet. But the one man with the deepest right to know had been erased from the truth entirely. And the first thing he did when he found out was apologize. A stranger apologized faster than my own mother had. I called him the next day. His voice was deeper than I expected. Warm, slightly rough. A man who had spent his life working with wood and talking over machinery. "Faith," he said slowly, like my name mattered. I told him everything I knew. He didn't interrupt, not once. When I finished, he exhaled and said, "When your mother stopped returning my calls in '85, I knew something had changed. I wrote her a letter asking if there was anything I needed to know. I closed my eyes. She never wrote back," he said. Of course she didn't. He told me about his life. He had been 24 when he met Linda, a carpenter working on the Delaney farmhouse roof while Gerald was away. He said they were close for a few weeks, then suddenly she cut contact. No explanation. He moved on, built a business, married a woman named Dorothy, had 2 sons, lost his wife to pancreatic cancer 5 years earlier. "My life's been small," he said. "My workshop, my boys, Sunday dinners, nothing fancy." Then he added quietly, "I never felt like anything was missing until I got your message." I sat on the edge of my bed with tears running down my face and said, "I'm not ready to meet in person yet." "That's all right," he said. "I've waited 40 years without knowing I was waiting. I can wait a little longer." Do you know what it does to a person? To be welcomed by someone who owed you nothing? I didn't. Not until then. A week later, my mother came to the hospital during my shift. The charge nurse told me someone was asking for me in the waiting room. I walked out and saw Linda sitting under fluorescent lights in a coat buttoned all the way up, even though the weather was warm. She looked older, smaller, as if exposure had taken weight off her structure. "I need to talk to you," she said. "I'm working." 5 minutes. We stood in the parking lot beneath the emergency entrance sign while moths circled the light. "You need to stop digging," she said. "This is going to destroy everything we built." I laughed once without humor. "What did we build, Mom? A family or a performance?" She shifted tactics instantly. That was another one of her gifts, emotional shapeshifting. "I sacrificed everything," she said softly. "I stayed in a marriage full of punishment. I endured your father's silence. I paid for this every day." "You stayed because you were afraid," I said. "And then you turned your fear into my inheritance." Her face hardened. "If you contact Thomas Calloway," she said, "I will never forgive you." I looked at her for a long moment and realized something simple and devastating. She still thought forgiveness was leverage. "You need to forgive yourself," I said. "Not me." Then I went back inside. 2 weeks after that, Gerald called. He hadn't called me voluntarily in years. "I want to explain," he said. "You've had 40 years. Silence. Then, "I was afraid. If I told you, your mother would fall apart. If she fell apart, everything else would fall apart with her. The store, the church, the farm, your reputation." He didn't deny it. "I didn't know another way," he said. That might have been the truest thing he'd ever told me. "Gerald," I said, and the use of his first name surprised us both. "I'm going to contact Thomas, not to hurt you, because I deserve the truth, and because Lily deserves accurate medical history." He was silent so long I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "I hope he's a good man." That was the closest he ever came to blessing what came next. Months passed in pieces. Ryan showed up at my apartment one night looking like he hadn't slept properly since the reunion. He stood in my doorway and said Mom wasn't eating, Dad was sleeping at the store, and I needed to come fix it. I told him no. Not because I didn't care, because I was done being the emotional repair system for damage I didn't create. Then, for the first time in his life, Ryan cracked. He brought up a birthday I'd forgotten, a time Gerald had forgotten mine, and Ryan had defended him by saying Dad was just tired. "I get it now," he said. And that was Ryan's version of an apology. Small, late, real. It was enough to begin. I wrote a letter to Linda and Gerald after that. Not dramatic, not cruel, just clear. I told them I didn't hate them, but I would no longer live inside a story written without my consent. I said I needed space and that I would decide when contact resumed. That was the first real boundary I ever drew with my family. And do you know what boundary really means? It means this: my peace is no longer negotiable just because your comfort depends on my silence. 6 months after the reunion, in December, I drove east toward Granville to meet Thomas in person. 3 hours. That's how far my biological father had lived from me my entire life. 3 hours from my mother's lie. 3 hours from my childhood. 3 hours from the daughter he never knew he had. Close enough that we might have stood in line at the same gas station and never known. Ohio in December is all muted colors. Flat fields, bare trees, church steeples, roads that seem to run straight through memory. By the time my GPS said I was 2 miles away, my heart was pounding like I was walking into trauma. I turned onto a residential road, saw a mailbox that read Callaway, and pulled into the driveway of a small wooden house with a workshop behind it. He was already standing on the porch, hands in his jacket pockets, waiting. Thomas Callaway was taller than I expected. Silver hair swept back, work-worn hands, shoulders still strong, and those eyes, my eyes. We stood about 15 feet apart for a few seconds that felt longer than 40 years. Then he smiled, gently, carefully, and said, "You have my mother's eyes." I almost laughed from the absurdity of it. I had spent my whole life being told where my features might have come from, and suddenly someone was saying it like fact. "And you have my nose," he added. That broke the tension. He stepped forward and offered his hand. I took it. His grip was firm, warm, calloused. He held on just half a second longer than a normal handshake. Not possession, not performance, recognition. Inside, the house was simple and beautiful. Handmade furniture everywhere. Warm wood tones, framed photos on the walls. 2 men I didn't know immediately looked familiar. His sons, Rob and James, my brothers, half-brothers technically. But unlike that reunion, the word didn't wound this time. It expanded something. We sat at his kitchen table with coffee between us and talked for hours. About his wife Dorothy, about his sons, about his workshop, about my nursing career, about Lily, about the life he didn't know he had missed. Then he took me into the workshop. The smell hit first. Oak, cedar, linseed oil, sawdust. I had never been in a room that smelled so much like making. Tools lined the walls. Projects sat mid-finished on benches. A small jewelry box, cabinet doors, a dining table in progress. Every corner of the room carried patience in it. "I build to order," he said, running a hand over a tabletop. "Every grain is different. No 2 pieces are ever the same." I told him every patient in the ER was like that too. He smiled like he liked that answer. Then he showed me an unfinished rocking chair. "For my granddaughter," he said. It was beautiful already. Without thinking, I told him about Lily, about the adoption, about the way a false medical history had nearly delayed her future. He listened. Then he said, "Would you want me to make one for her too?" I stared at him. He didn't ask it casually. He asked it like a man offering a place in the shape of his life. "You want to be her grandfather?" I asked. "If you'll let me." I cried in his workshop holding a shop rag because it was the nearest thing available, and for the first time since the reunion, those tears were not made of grief. They were made of being chosen. That matters more than people admit. Blood tells you one story. Choice tells you another. And sometimes choice heals what blood complicated. After that visit, things began to settle into new shapes. Megan stayed close. Ryan softened. Our mother wrote a 3-page letter full of explanation and still no apology. Gerald remained distant, predictable in his limits. But my life was no longer revolving around their silence. Lily's caseworker confirmed the updated medical history. The adoption process moved forward. When I visited Lily that winter, she sat on the front steps in a coat too big for her and asked, "Are you the one who's going to take me home?" I knelt and tied her shoes and said, "If you want me to." She looked at me like the answer was obvious. "I do." The adoption was finalized in May. The judge signed the papers on a Tuesday afternoon. Thomas was there. So were Rob and James. So was Megan. So was June. Not Gerald. Not Linda. And strangely, that felt right. Because family, I was learning, is not only the people who were there at the beginning, it is the people who show up for the truth. A few weeks after the adoption, the rocking chair arrived from Granville wrapped in moving blankets. White oak, smooth arms, high back, beautiful craftsmanship, carved neatly at the top, LD, Lily Delaney. I kept the name Delaney, not because I owed it to Gerald, because it was mine. I had lived under that name for 40 years. I had survived under it, worked under it, earned degrees under it, signed divorce papers under it, comforted dying patients under it, loved and lost and rebuilt under it. It belonged to me now. not because of who gave it, but because of what I had carried inside it. Months later, I took Lily to Granville to meet Thomas. She talked the entire drive, about school, about a dog she wanted, about a friend named Marcus, about literally everything. When we arrived, Thomas was on the porch with Rob and James, 3 men with shared features, shared posture, shared history. And then there was me, not a secret, not a disruption, not an inconvenience, a daughter. Thomas crouched down when Lily stepped out of the car. "Are you the grandpa who made my chair?" she asked. "I am. It smells like outside." Thomas laughed so hard his shoulders shook. "That," he said, "is the best review I've ever gotten." We ate lunch around the big oak table. Lily sat with her new cousins, Rob's daughter, James's son, family expanding not through pretending, but through knowing. Before I left that day, we took a photo on the porch, Thomas in the center, Rob and James beside him, their wives, their kids, me holding Lily. When I looked at the picture later, something caught in my throat. For the first time in my life, I was not on the edge of the frame. I was in the center. That is a bigger thing than it sounds like. Some people spend their whole lives trying to be loved. Others spend their whole lives trying to understand why love around them always felt slightly misaligned. And sometimes the answer is not that there was something wrong with you. Sometimes the answer is that you were standing inside a false story, trying to make your instincts fit someone else's lie. My name is Faith Delaney. I'm an ER nurse. I'm a mother. I'm the daughter of Thomas Calloway, a carpenter from Granville, Ohio, who waited 40 years without knowing he was waiting. I'm also the daughter of a woman who never learned how to tell the truth without first losing control. And I'm the child of a man named Gerald Delaney, who stayed, tried, failed, and taught me, without meaning to, that endurance is not the same thing as love. I don't hate either of them, but I am done shrinking myself to protect the people who lied to me. Lily knows Thomas as Grandpa. He visits once a month and brings her small pieces of wood so she can learn the difference between oak and maple by touch and smell. She keeps them lined up on her windowsill like treasures. Ryan and I talk more honestly now than we ever did before. Megan and I are closer than we've ever been. Linda and I have spoken only a handful of times. She still hasn't said I'm sorry, and I no longer need her to. Some people are incapable of giving the exact thing they owe you. That is tragic. But it is also clarifying, because once you stop waiting for the perfect apology, you can finally start building a truthful life without it. That is what I have done. I didn't get justice in the cinematic sense. No one stood up in front of the whole family and confessed. No grand redemption arc unfolded. No dramatic punishment arrived. What I got was something quieter. Truth, choice, a new father, a daughter, a different future. And maybe that's better, because the opposite of a counterfeit life is not a perfect one. It is a real one, and real is enough. So if you've ever been the person in the family who felt slightly out of place, if you've ever been told not to ask questions because asking would ruin everything, if you've ever realized that peace in your family depended on your silence, I want you to hear me carefully. You are not wrong for wanting the truth. You are not selfish for refusing to carry a secret that was never yours. And you are not destroying a family by naming what was broken long before you found the courage to speak. Sometimes asking the question is the most loving thing you can do for yourself. And sometimes one envelope, one test, one crack in the wall is all it takes for your real life to finally begin. If this story stayed with you, comment below and tell me honestly, what would you have done at that reunion table? Would you have stayed quiet, or would you have asked? And if you want more stories like this, deep family secrets, emotional betrayals, and the kind of truths that change everything, subscribe now, because some lies don't end when they're exposed. Sometimes that's only where the real story begins.